My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 70 years old, and I was the village midwife here in Little Moorhaven for over 30 years. I've delivered more than 350 babies in these Yorkshire dales, but there's one story I've never told a soul, a story that haunts me every single night. It's about a birth I attended in February 1993, when a woman paid me to say the baby had died. But that child was born alive and healthy, and now, after 30 years, that baby, now a grown man, has appeared at my cottage door, searching for answers. I'm sitting here in my garden looking out over the moors, with my cup of tea growing cold in my hands, because I can't bear this burden any longer. You'll understand why I took that money, why I lied, and how that lie destroyed not just my peace of mind, but the lives of so many good people. When you're desperate and frightened, sometimes you make choices you never thought you'd make. This is my confession, and I'm going to tell you everything exactly as it happened, without leaving out a single detail. Settle in, because this is a story that needs telling. It was a Tuesday morning in March when that letter arrived. I was in my garden, deadheading the daffodils and watching the sheep graze on the hillside, when the postman came up the stone path with an envelope addressed just to me. When I opened it and saw the name Sarah Whitfield, my blood ran cold. That was a name I'd tried to forget for 30 years. The letter read, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I know you'll remember me. I'm Sarah Whitfield. I desperately need to speak with you about that night in February 1993. My son, our secret, he's found me. Please, I'm working at the surgery in Grassington now. It's urgent. Sarah Whitfield." The 17-year-old girl who came to my cottage on a stormy February night, accompanied by an elegant woman who called herself Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, the girl who made me part of the biggest lie of my life. "Everything all right, Gran?" asked my grandson Tommy, popping his head over the garden gate. "Yes, love. Just a letter from an old acquaintance." But I knew I couldn't run from this anymore. The baby I'd helped disappear was now a 30-year-old man, and apparently he'd discovered the truth. My reckoning had finally come. 30 years ago, early hours of February 14th, 1993. The wind was howling across the moors, rattling the windows of my stone cottage, when there came desperate pounding at my door. It was 2 a.m. I was 40 then, experienced and respected as the village midwife. I opened the door to find Sarah, a 17-year-old in the throes of labor, supported by an impeccably dressed woman in her 50s, with a cut glass accent and an air of authority. "Mrs. Thompson, you must help us," the elegant woman pleaded. "No one can know about this birth. Absolutely no one." Sarah was crying from pain and shame. She was from one of the old farming families in the village, and the father of the baby had vanished the moment he learned of the pregnancy. "Mrs. Ashworth has promised to sort everything out," Sarah whispered between contractions. "She's promised no one will ever know. I prepared everything for the delivery, never imagining I was about to become part of something that would torment me for the rest of my life. In my cozy cottage, with its low beams and rose-covered walls, a lie was about to be born alongside an innocent child. The labor was difficult because Sarah was so young, but the baby was born healthy and perfect. A beautiful boy with bright blue eyes and dark hair. His first cries filled my cottage, echoing off the old stone walls. Sarah, exhausted but radiant, held her son close. Tears streamed down her face as she gazed at him. "He's perfect, isn't he, Mrs. Thompson?" she whispered, kissing his tiny forehead. "Look at those beautiful eyes." That's when Mrs. Ashworth approached. She pulled a thick envelope from her expensive handbag and placed it on my oak table. "Mrs. Thompson, you're going to issue a death certificate," she said in her crisp, authoritative voice. "This baby was stillborn. Sarah will recover and return to her normal life. This money ensures that this night never happened." I stared at that envelope. It contained more money than I'd seen in my entire life. Enough to fix my cottage roof, pay for my mother's care home fees, give my own children better opportunities. "And what about the baby?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "He'll go to a good family, somewhere far from here. He'll have everything he needs," Mrs. Ashworth replied coldly. I took that cursed money and sealed a pact that would change so many lives. "No one will ever know," I promised, not understanding the price I would pay for those words. Mrs. Ashworth took the baby away before dawn. She'd come prepared. Baby clothes, bottles, blankets, everything planned in advance. She took that precious child from Sarah's arms as if she were collecting a parcel. Sarah couldn't stop crying. She begged for just one more minute with him, kissed his head, whispered something in his ear that I'll never know. Then she handed him over and turned her face to the wall. "Take good care of him," was all she could manage to say. Sarah stayed with me for 3 more days to recover. She barely spoke, just sat by my cottage window looking out over the moors, as if she expected to see her baby coming back across the fields. "Mrs. Thompson, have I done the right thing?" she asked on her last day. I didn't know how to answer. How could I tell a 17-year-old girl that she'd done right by giving up her own child? I held her hand and said, "You did what you could, love. You were so very young." After she left, I burned everything that reminded me of that birth. Everything except 2 things: the false death certificate I'd made and a small teddy bear Sarah had brought for the baby but forgotten. I kept them in a biscuit tin, thinking someday I'd throw them away. I never did. With Mrs. Ashworth's money, I was able to keep my mother in a proper care home when her dementia worsened. I also repaired my cottage and sent my children to better schools in Harrogate. But dear God, every time I saw my mother comfortable and well cared for, every time I saw my children with opportunities I couldn't have given them otherwise, I remembered the price I'd paid for it all. For years, I had terrible nightmares. I'd dream of a baby crying somewhere on the moors, and I'd search and search but never find him. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, looking around my cottage for a child who wasn't there. My husband David, bless his soul, was worried sick about me. "What's wrong, Maggie? What are these dreams about?" "Nothing, love, just silly nightmares." But I knew they weren't silly nightmares. It was my conscience demanding payment. It was that precious baby boy who wouldn't leave my thoughts. I stopped being a midwife a few years later. I couldn't bear to deliver another baby without thinking of the one who'd officially died, but who I knew was alive somewhere. Sarah left the village shortly after. I heard she went to Leeds to train as a nurse. She married, had other children, but every time someone mentioned her name, my heart would skip a beat. And the baby, oh, that baby lived in my thoughts every single day. I'd imagine him taking his first steps, starting school, learning to ride a bicycle. I always wondered, is he happy? Is the family that took him truly good to him? When I received that letter, I knew I couldn't keep running. I asked my son Michael to drive me to the medical surgery in Grassington, where Sarah worked as a practice nurse. My word, when I saw her again. The frightened 17-year-old was now a composed woman of 47, but I recognized her instantly. Those same green eyes, only now they carried a sadness that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Thompson," she stood up from her desk. "You came." "I had to come, Sarah. I got your letter." She led me to a small consultation room where we could speak privately. We sat facing each other, and it felt as though those 30 years had never passed. The weight in the air was the same as it had been that February night. "He found me, Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice trembling. "My son found me." My heart nearly stopped. "What do you mean, love?" "He came to the surgery last week. A man of 30, the spitting image of his father. He told me he'd always known he was adopted, but now he'd discovered the truth. He has his real birth certificate." I was speechless. How had he managed to uncover the truth? Mrs. Ashworth had promised everything would be buried forever. "He wants answers, Mrs. Thompson. He wants to know why his own mother declared him dead. He wants to know who else was involved in the lie. That's when I realized my time of reckoning had finally arrived. Sarah told me the whole story. The boy's name is James Parker, and he was raised by a family in Manchester. Mrs. Ashworth had kept her word. He'd gone to a good family, had an education, became a teacher. But he'd always known he was adopted. His adoptive parents, Robert and Mary Parker, were honest people. When he turned 21, they told him the truth, that a woman had brought him as a tiny baby, saying his birth mother couldn't care for him. They were wonderful parents, Sarah said through her tears. They gave him everything I couldn't give him at that age. James had married, had children of his own, built a good life. But he'd always wanted to know his real story. He'd started searching a few years ago, even hired a private investigator. He discovered that I'd registered him as deceased, Sarah continued. He found your name, Mrs. Thompson, and he discovered that Mrs. Ashworth wasn't who she claimed to be. What do you mean? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Victoria Ashworth was married to my cousin Philip, the baby's father. She orchestrated the whole thing to cover up her husband's affair. She made me lie, made you lie, all to protect her marriage and social standing. When I heard this, my world crumbled. It hadn't been just a desperate girl wanting to hide a pregnancy. It had been a calculating woman who destroyed lives to maintain her reputation. Sarah gave me James's phone number. He wants to speak with you, Mrs. Thompson. He's not angry. He just wants to understand. With shaking hands, I called him that very afternoon. His voice was deep, educated, gentle. Mrs. Thompson, this is James Parker. Do you remember me? I remember you, dear boy, I said, and the endearment slipped out before I could stop it. I'd very much like to meet with you, if you'd be willing. We arranged to meet the next day in the village tea room in Little Moorhaven. When I arrived and saw him, dear Lord, he was the image of his father. Same build, same dark hair, same confident manner. But he had Sarah's kind green eyes. Mrs. Thompson, he approached respectfully. Thank you for agreeing to see me. We sat by the window overlooking the village green, and there, with the Yorkshire stone buildings as our backdrop and the scent of fresh scones in the air, I told him everything. No lies, no omissions. I told him about Sarah's fear, about Mrs. Ashworth's proposition, about the money that made me agree to the deception. I told him about the nightmares, the guilt, the 30 years of carrying that burden. You did what you thought was right at the time, he said kindly. I haven't come here to judge anyone. I just wanted to understand my story. But I could see in his eyes the pain of someone who'd grown up not knowing why he'd been unwanted by his birth mother. James had done extensive research. He'd uncovered that Mrs. Victoria Ashworth wasn't a wealthy benefactor helping unfortunate girls. She was married to Philip, Sarah's cousin, who'd gotten her pregnant and then disappeared. Philip never really disappeared, James told me. He always knew I existed. Victoria forced him to cut all contact with Sarah and arranged for me to vanish. But that wasn't the end of it. James had discovered that Philip had had other affairs, other women had become pregnant, and Victoria had always found ways to make the problems disappear. She paid for at least 3 terminations that I've been able to verify, James said quietly. And in my case, since Sarah was already 8 months along, she concocted this adoption scheme. I was horrified. This hadn't been an isolated incident. It was a pattern. That woman had been destroying lives to maintain the facade of her perfect marriage. Where is she now? I asked. She died 4 years ago. Cancer. Philip divorced her shortly before she died, when he finally learned everything she'd done. So the man who was James's father was still alive, and according to James, he wanted to meet his son. He wants to apologize, Mrs. Thompson. He says he was a coward, that he should have taken responsibility from the beginning. James asked me to be present when he met his father. "You've been part of my story since the moment I was born," he said. "I'd like you to be there." Philip arrived at my cottage on a Saturday afternoon. A man of 52, silver-haired but still handsome, carrying a bag full of photographs and documents he'd kept all these years. "Mrs. Thompson," he said when he saw me, "I've come to ask your forgiveness for my cowardice, for allowing Victoria to do what she did." When James arrived, the two men stood looking at each other for what felt like an eternity. It was like watching someone meet their reflection across time. The resemblance was uncanny. "Dad," James said, and the word came out rough with emotion. "Son," Philip replied, and broke down completely. They embraced there in my cottage garden among the roses and lavender, and I wept with them. After 30 years of lying that this boy was dead, I was watching him embrace his father. Philip explained that he'd always wanted to find his son, but Victoria had threatened to destroy him if he tried. She said she'd tell everyone in the county that I was involved with minors, he explained. She said she'd ruin my life. "Why didn't you look for me after she died?" James asked. "Because I thought it was too late. I thought you'd hate me." But James didn't hate anyone. He was a good man, well-balanced, who just wanted to piece together his history. The next step was the meeting between James and Sarah. She was terrified, convinced her son would despise her for killing him on paper. We met again at my cottage. Sarah arrived first, nervous as a cat, wringing her hands constantly. "What if he can't forgive me, Mrs. Thompson? What if he thinks I'm an unnatural mother?" "Hush now, love. You were just a child yourself. You did what you thought was best." When James arrived, Sarah stood frozen by my fireplace. He was the one who crossed the room to her. "Mom," he said softly. Sarah collapsed. She cried 30 years worth of grief, guilt, and sleepless nights wondering about the son she'd never seen grow up. "Forgive me," she sobbed. "Forgive me for saying you were dead. Forgive me for not fighting to keep you." James held her as she wept. This woman who'd given birth to him but had been forced to let him go. But the reunion wasn't all joy. Sarah had built a new life. She was married to a good man, had 2 other children. Her husband knew nothing of this history. Her children didn't know they had an older brother. "I have to tell them," Sarah said, "but I'm terrified of destroying my family." Truth sometimes hurts even when it sets you free. When Sarah told her husband and children the truth, her family nearly fell apart. Her husband, David, felt betrayed by 25 years of marriage built on a secret. "How could you hide this from me?" he demanded, according to what Sarah told me later. "How could you pretend for so long that nothing had happened?" Her children were shocked. The eldest, a 24-year-old daughter, supported her mother. But her youngest, a 16-year-old son, couldn't accept it. "You've lied to us our whole lives," he told Sarah. "How can I ever trust you again?" The family Sarah had carefully built over decades was crumbling because of a secret she'd carried for 30 years. James was devastated when he learned what his appearance had caused. "I never wanted to destroy her family," he told me. "Perhaps it would have been better to leave things as they were." But I told him, "Son, truth always demands payment. But lies exact a price too, just over a longer time." Sarah came to see me a few days later, her eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Thompson, I don't know if I did the right thing telling them. My family is falling apart." "A family doesn't fall apart because of truth, Sarah. It falls apart because of lies that were maintained for too long." But deep down, I felt guilty too. If I hadn't taken that money 30 years ago, none of this would have happened. Several months passed. Sarah's family was still adjusting, but gradually they were coming to terms with the truth. Her husband was still hurt, but he didn't want a divorce. "I love her," David told me when he came to understand the full story. "I just wish she'd trusted me enough to tell me from the beginning." James began visiting Sarah slowly. Her children were accepting him, especially when they saw he wanted nothing more than to complete his family picture. "I have my adoptive parents, whom I love dearly," he told them. "I just want to understand where I came from." But the person who surprised me most was my own great-granddaughter, little Emma. When I told her the story, she asked me a question that left me speechless. "Great-gran, if you hadn't taken that money, would great-great-grandma have had to go to a horrible place?" It was true. Mrs. Ashworth's money had paid for my mother's private care home. My mother had lived her final years in comfort and dignity because of that tainted money. "It's complicated, darling," I replied. "Sometimes we do wrong things for right reasons. But James was sad growing up not knowing his real mommy, wasn't he?" "Yes, that's why there are no good lies, Emma. Someone always gets hurt." It was talking to a child that made me realize something. I couldn't change the past, but I could make peace with it. I'm finishing this story a year after it all began. James is now part of our extended family. He visits me monthly, brings his children to meet Gran Maggie. Sarah and her husband have worked through their difficulties. He understood that she was just a teenager when it all happened, that she was as much a victim as James. Her children have accepted their older brother too. Philip has become a devoted grandfather to James's children. He's trying to make up for the 30 years he lost with his son, but without rushing, respecting James's own pace. And me? I finally sleep without nightmares. Not because I've forgotten what I did, but because I've learned that carrying guilt for a lifetime won't undo the mistake. James said something to me that I'll never forget. "Mrs. Thompson, you may have lied about my death, but you gave me life twice. Once when you delivered me, and again when you agreed to tell the truth. Today I know that Mrs. Ashworth's money was dirty, but what I did with it, caring for my mother, wasn't wrong. My mother lived her final years in peace and dignity. The wrong I did created good, even without my knowing it. I'm not saying it was right to lie. I'm saying that life is too complicated to judge people solely by the mistakes they've made. James exists. He's alive. He has a family. He's happy. Sarah managed to rebuild her life. Philip has redeemed his past. And I've learned that it's never too late to do the right thing. If there's someone out there carrying a heavy secret, listen to what this old village midwife has to say. Truth hurts, but lies hurt for longer. It's better to face the storm once than to spend your whole life running from the rain. This is my story. The story of a lie that lasted 30 years, but which ultimately brought a family home.